As member for North Vancouver Seymour.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I am standing here looking forward to speaking in support of the amendment. But before that, I wanted to address something that a previous member from the opposite side mentioned. One of my constituents, who actually is quite knowledgeable in this topic, Dr. Edmonds, has advised me on numerous occasions about the issue of proportional representation. In actual fact, he's not a supporter of it. He's actually, he did share with me that he had voted NDP in the past election, so he wasn't supporting me, but he doesn't support PR either. And his question was to me to ask everybody here, if you want to, or you think you want to, expand our electoral system into proportional representation, then what are you willing to give up? And I think that's the key, because it's no doubt that this bill, the proportional representation bill, is designed to increase Green seats. And that might be okay for some people, and certainly the Green people and all of the supporters of the Green people think this is great. 16% of the voters in the last May's election actually voted Green. So that's okay. But by changing the electoral system to allow more Green seats, we are also increasing the chances of fringe parties that we may not want. And this is the thing that we got to consider. Because after listening to the remarks of the member from Vancouver West End, I was very concerned with the way that he talked about the argument about LGBTQ rights, and that wouldn't it be good to have more parties that focused on trans and LGBTQ rights. Well, you know what? I actually agree. But in proportional representation, what are you willing to give up in that if we did have proportional representation, what are the chances of more anti-LGBTQ people binding together to make a party and also getting elected? We also know what's been going on in Chilliwack. There's a group called Culture Guard in Chilliwack. Are we wanting them to form a political party and get some seats? And before you say that this has not happened, let's talk about Indonesia. Indonesia elects their People's Representative Council via a PR system. There are two parties that are anti-LGBTQ. The Prosperous Justice Party has 40 seats. The United Development Party has 39 seats. And they propose bills to ban LGBTQ activism and criminalize LGBTQ people rights and behavior in 2016. So my question to everybody, if you think PR is going to increase just the Greens, it's also going to increase fringe parties that we might not feel too comfortable with. So moving on to the actual amendment, Madam Speaker. One of the reasons why I am supporting the amendment is to give us more time to actually think about this sort of stuff. And so the member from Nechako Lakes said that he was moving this amendment to say deleting the word now and substituting it for 6 months. And upon moving that motion, that member said, the intent of this motion is to allow people, government, and the various parties to be able to go forward, have more consultation, and get people to have a better understanding, a more full understanding of what this proposal is for proportional representation, because we all have heard from the other folks in the House that we don't know actually what this question is going to be. It's critical that if we're going to move forward, people must understand what they're voting for. And I remember my dad, God rest his soul, the thing that he used to tell me when I grew up was there's only one thing worse if people do not vote. And the worst thing for not voting is voting for something that you don't know you're voting. Always, Jane, he used to say to me, always vote for the ones that you know. Vote for the parties that you know. And he always encouraged me to meet my elected representatives. And in fact, in the first past the post system of which I got elected in, it's really easy to meet me. I've got an open door policy. You can make an appointment. Obviously, it's a good idea to make an appointment because somebody could walk in off the street today into my office and they wouldn't find me there. I'm actually here. But certainly you can walk in off the street. I am accessible, Madam Speaker. I'm everywhere. Now, is everybody that's going to be elected through a PR system going to be at that accessible? I've heard people complain in areas that have PR in European countries that say, I never get to see my elected representative. In fact, I don't even know who my elected representative is. Because most of the forms of proportional representation have party lists. And I'm not going to repeat what I said in my last remarks last month when I was talking about the bill. But suffice to say, again, if we are going to support a system like proportional representation, what are we willing to give up? Are we willing to give up personal representation for people to have easy and accessible access to their individual MLAs? Now, I can tell you, I do have somebody that has written me on this quite a bit, and he has some great ideas. In fact, he was the Green candidate that ran against the member for Vancouver West End. And he supports proportional representation, but not all forms. He told me that there's a couple of systems, PR systems, that would actually help the negative talk about some levels of proportional representation with regards to having an individual MLA that you could easily access, or even, as my members, my colleagues here from rural British Columbia who are really, really worried about the diminishment of rural representation. He brings up the examples of what's going on in the Scottish National Parliament, as well as, and I hope I get this right, the German state of Baden-Württemberg. I would be really, really interested to learn more about these systems of PR, but right now, I bet you there's nobody in this House that is familiar with these. And the fact is that we need more time. If we are going to be voting on a system, we need more time to figure out what these systems are. So if, as I said before, we want to elect a PR system, whatever that PR system is, what are we willing to give up? And that is my point. Right now, what we have is an Attorney General who has already indicated in his remarks today and yesterday in the House that he is biased in favor of proportional representation. That's not right, Madam Speaker, because that is not an unbiased opinion of somebody that is actually going to be making a decision that will influence the electoral system of all British Columbians. And for now, that's just under 5 million people. So one Attorney General, 22 members in Cabinet plus a Premier making a decision for 4.8 million people in British Columbia. But I digress. How do we get here? So way back in May, the 2017 Confidence and Supply Agreement between the BC Green Caucus and the BC New Democrat Caucus was announced. And under Section 3 of the agreement and under the subheading, Making Democracy Work for People, the two parties stated their commitment to proportional representation and declared their commitment to introduce proportional representation in the Legislative Assembly in this session, and they have done that. Great, one promise. But we've also passed a bill that proposes to change the laws surrounding campaign finance fundraising, a bill that amends the Constitution Act to ascribe a different meaning to the definition of what it means to actually be a political party, and now this bill, which attempts to make wholesale changes to our voting systems and the way we pick our elected officials. These three bills speak to the heart of our democracy here in British Columbia. And the accumulated effect of these bills are set to change our democratic system in a way that stacks the deck for both the NDP, but I could argue more for the Greens. And neither party, neither one of those two parties actually won the election last May, but combined, they did get one more seat than the BC Liberals. So our current system is first past the post, and it is the most common electoral system in democratic elections. Under the current first past the post system, each voter gets one vote and chooses one candidate to represent their constituency. The candidate who wins more votes than another is elected. Thus, each first past the post constituency has one MLA who is personally accountable to their voters and their respective constituency. It's very uncomplicated and a straightforward process. And that highlights some of the key advantages. It's simple, and they have one MLA. My constituents, as I mentioned before, find it very, very easy to come and visit me. They have great access to me. And I represent everybody in my constituents, not just the people that voted for me. And with a stronger link between constituents and elected representatives, accountability is increased. My accountability is increased. Certainly, there are people that support me as a person, even if they didn't support my party. They supported me. I am elected to represent, as I said, all of my constituents, and that is what I do. Almost all of the models, Madam Speaker, like mixed member plurality, or the MMP one that apparently the leader of the Green Party has expressed an interest in, have party lists. In addition to an elected MLA in a particular riding, depending on the provincial percentage of votes that other parties got, those party leaders would appoint MLAs to certain regions. That, Madam Speaker, in my opinion, is a lack of accountability. Again, I recognize that there are other models out there, but give us the time with this amendment to actually examine them before we actually vote on whether or not we want proportional representation to begin with. But that's not to say we haven't put the question of proportional representation to the electorate. We did in 2005 and again in 2009. The BC Liberals held 2 referendums on proportional representation. That would make this proposed referendum our 3rd in 13 years. But what's different about this proposed referendum when compared to the other 2? Prior to the 2005 referendum, the process was handed over to the public through the creation of a 161-member panel on electoral reform. The BC Citizens' Assembly was created in an effort to determine what kind of improvements needed to be made and how the referendum question would be processed. British Columbians from every corner of the province were consulted, and the process was universally lauded for its independence and impartiality. From this extensive consultation, the Citizens' Assembly recommended a referendum on the single transferable vote. And after being put to a vote in 2005 and ultimately failing to meet the minimum threshold, the question was again proposed to British Columbians in a 2009 referendum. Moreover, the government promoted public awareness and understanding of the 2 elected systems openly and transparently, and provided equal funds to supporters and detractors of each system. This was a truly public process. And while the first referendum was close, the second was not. And the STV suffered a wholesale defeat with only 39% voting in favour of the proposed reform. Now, we have the Green Party, a party that had the support of only 16% of the popular vote, wielding the balance of power and dictating policy for all British Columbians. And one person, as I mentioned before, the Attorney General, will be making that decision. So, is there a model of proportional representation that the Attorney feels would be better suited for British Columbia? How about some examples in Europe where proportional representation is widespread? Consider the system of proportional representation currently in place in the Netherlands, where there has been a proliferation of no fewer than 28 smaller special interest parties, and where 13 of them currently sit in Parliament. Or what about the system in Belgium, where it took 589 days without a government to form a 6-party coalition government? What about Germany? Everybody seems to be talking about Germany until recently. It almost looked like the coalition talks between Chancellor Merkel's CDU-CDS alliance, the Free Democratic Party, and the Green Party would successfully lead to the creation of a minority coalition government. Well, those talks fell apart on November 19th, with immigration being cited as the major obstacle to any agreement being reached. With 51% of Germans now supporting a new election, there's the fear that the far-right anti-immigration party Alternative for Germany, which secured 94 seats in Parliament, would stand to gain even more seats. For decades, it appeared as if far-right anti-immigration pro-Nazi fringe groups like AfD had been sidelined. Yet in recent years, European voters seem particularly attracted to the political rhetoric of the extreme right. In the Netherlands, we now see the Freedom Party holding 20 of 150 seats. This is a party whose leader has called for the banning of the Quran, the closing of mosques, and a halt to immigration from non-Western countries. In Austria, the Freedom Party of Austria currently holds 51 of 138 seats in the lower house and 13 of 61 in the upper house. This is a party that was founded by former SS officers and whose party leader has called for a ban on Muslim symbolism in response to Austria being Islamified. In 2000, the FPO was even part of a governing coalition. Throughout Europe, a recent string of confusing and inconclusive elections have eroded political stability from Spain to Ireland to Slovakia and Portugal. Elections across the EU have produced fractured parliaments, improbable and unstable coalitions, weaker, more divided, and more extreme governments. Madam Speaker, I find it quite reasonable to suggest that the rise in popularity of far-right populist parties is partly owed to the electoral systems that have given them legitimacy. Smaller parties get a disproportionate amount of power, which leads to horse trading between parties during post-election transition periods. Look no further than the BC election last spring, where the Libertarian Party took 0.4% of the vote, the Christian Heritage Party took 0.717% of the vote, the Vancouver Island Party took 0.03% of the vote, and the Communist Party of BC took 0.04% of the vote. But thinking ahead to the next provincial election would be premature. Unfortunately for myself and all British Columbians, we've still yet to find out what exactly the system is of PR that we're even being allowed to vote on. That's because the NDP won't release the ballot question until after this bill's debate has passed. Again, that is why I'm supporting this amendment for delay. Madam Speaker, the single biggest demarcation from the referendum posed in this bill and the referendums of 2005 and 2009 is the lack of transparency in the public engagement process. Gone is the report from the Independent Citizens Assembly. Instead, the NDP and the Greens say the government will ultimately determine the outcome, which is going on right now with regards to their consultation, after they hold these so-called non-binding public consultations on a new system. And don't take my word for it on what people are saying about this consultation. I will quote a portion of what Keith Baldry has said. I think it is very clear this government is stacking the deck in favour of getting people to vote for proportional representation in the referendum next November, a mail-in ballot. Or Vaughn Palmer said, it is designed to create a rosy set of responses on what the NDP and the Greens want, which is a system of proportional representation that will entrench the Greens in the legislature and make it more likely that we will have these kinds of coalition governments in the future. Given the government's enthusiasm and support for proportional representation, a more neutral questionnaire would have been more helpful. Despite assurances from the now Premier back in May that the referendum question would be a binary yes or no option, that's now gone out the window. So again, in conclusion, Madam Speaker, as I wrap up my comments on the amendment, I'd like to reinforce my strong objections to not only the content of the bill, but the spirit of it. To radically change our electoral system because of the NDP's capitulation to backroom demands of the Green Party strikes me as a real rotten deal for British Columbians. Should this bill pass, and should British Columbians be forced into a referendum, I feel we are destined for weaker governments, more frequent elections, and a politically splintered legislature. In closing, I'd like to repeat what I said before at the beginning. I'd like those who are currently in favour of proportional representation to think about just how much they are prepared to give up, and it may be more than what they think. We might be okay with increased Green seats. I'm not making a comment on that. But we might not be okay with fringe parties grasping more seats and allowing them to control more power, and therefore significantly influencing legislators of British Columbia in the future. So in closing, I think the future of our democracy here in British Columbia is actually at risk, Madam Speaker, and I would hope that everybody, in addition to researching this issue thoroughly, would support this amendment to put it on hold for a little bit of time so we could study it a little bit more and not make any rash decisions that might potentially make British Columbia worse than it is. Thank you.